Alright, I'm going to start upgrading the fuel system in my airplane today by putting in a new header tank, and I'm going to reposition where the fuel pressure and the fuel flow meters are installed as well. Okay, so here is the current setup of my fuel system. I've got a left fuel tank and a right fuel tank. There's multiple fuel pickups at the bottom edge of the tank. There's one that's in the back of it, there's one that's in the front of it, and there's another one that's more towards the front but not quite at the very front. And then there is also a fuel vent connection at the top of the tank. And there's a fuel vent that's on the cap on each tank. And so this fuel vent is actually connected between the two tanks to try to keep the air pressure inside the tanks about the same. And then we're also using the front pickup of the fuel tanks to be a cross feed between the two tanks to try to keep the fuel level balanced. It was an experiment. It didn't really work out. If I'm not parked perfectly level, obviously the fuel will drain to one side. And also even in flight, I had multiple situations where one tank would be draining a lot more than the other one. I think one time I landed and I had like 11 gallons on one side and only like 3 in the other side. Anyways, this system that we kind of experimented with, it didn't really work out. So anyways, the way it's set up right now is the rearmost fuel pickup and then the one that's more forward, they're teed together. And then the same is for the right, and that comes to a T intersection behind the seats. I'm going to be replacing this T intersection with the header tank, and I'm also going to be changing this front fuel pickup line. I'm also going to route it to the header tank on each side, getting rid of this cross feed experiment that just didn't really work out. So after the header tank, there's a fuel shutoff valve, and then there's a fuel filter. Then there's an electric fuel pump that's up in the engine. Then there's a fuel pressure sensor, a fuel flow sensor, and then there's a mechanical fuel pump, the engine-driven fuel pump, and then that finally goes to the carburetor. Now, the change that I'm going to make down here is I'm going to put the fuel pressure and the fuel flow sensors between the carburetor and the mechanical fuel pump. I'm also going to be changing the fuel flow sensor so that it is positioned so that the fuel has to pass upwards through the sensor. Right now the fuel is flowing downward through it. And so with this change, I'm hopefully going to be getting a better indication if I have a problem with my mechanical fuel pump. Right now my fuel pressure sensor, it only reads the pressure of the gravity feed system basically. And so it'll be like 0.5 psi or 1 psi. It won't be very much. If I turn on the electric fuel pump, because it is upstream of the fuel pressure sensor, the fuel pressure sensor will show me the pressure that the electric fuel pump is generating. So that's kind of a nice feature of where it's at right now. But most of the time, it's not giving me much of a reading at all. And if I'm in turbulence, it can even go to 0 fuel pressure temporarily. And so that's kind of disconcerting, and I can't actually set myself an alarm in my ethos because it would just be going off all the time. So by putting it in between the carburetor and the mechanical pump, I should be getting a consistent PSI. And then to solve the problem with bouncing around and not getting any pressure from the tanks, I'll have that nice header tank sitting there. So I'll have like a nice reserve of fuel in case turbulence or whatever prevents fuel from actually draining out from one of the tanks. So it's going to give me some safety. Okay, so here's where we're going to be installing the fuel tank. So this is behind the pilot seat. It's going to be strapped in, and these are the fuel lines I was talking about. So this top one, the top one here is the vent that cross feeds over to the other tank. This one is the fuel pickup that's in the bottom front of the tank that cross feeds to the other tank. I'm going to be cutting this and using this fuel pickup to feed into the header tank. Then this is the main fuel line right now. It's teed together up on the other side of this in the wing root, and it's coming down, and then it goes to this T intersection right here. This is the line from the right wing tank, and then this goes forward up towards the engine. It goes through the fuel shutoff valve here, and then it makes its way up here through a fuel filter and then into a bulkhead fitting here. Here's the other side of the bulkhead fitting. So this is coming up into this electric fuel pump. Here's the fuel pressure sensor. It comes down, goes through the fuel flow sensor here. Note how it's pointed down, and they want you to have it pointed up actually after it exits the fuel flow sensor to make it more accurate. And then it goes into the mechanical fuel pump, and then from here it goes right down into the carburetor right there. So my goal is to take this fuel flow sensor and this fuel pressure sensor and put it in between the mechanical fuel pump and the carburetor down here. So on the header tank, I've got the three ports on for the left and the right fuel tanks. Then I've got a drain down here that'll poke through the hole. That's right there. And then this is the fuel pickup that's going to be going to the engine. And then this is the fuel sense probe that'll give me a indication of the fuel quantity down to 1/10 of a gallon. And I've already got that calibrated. And so the ports on the side here, this is going to be connected to the front pickup on the left tank, and then this one is going to be connected to currently the main fuel line, but it's the one that's teed together with the rearmost fuel pickup, and then that one pickup that's towards the front, but it's not quite at the front. And then this will be the vent. So this is the fuel probe that I found that I could use for this this tank. I'm just going to re-record the audio that I took here. This fuel probe is pretty neat because it doesn't have any float inside of the tank. It just screws into a fitting, and it measures the fuel quantity based upon the pressure that it detects. You've got to calibrate the fuel probe by putting fuel into it, and the fuel probe actually plugs into that box I'm holding there, which contains a microcontroller that converts what it senses into a voltage between 0 and 5 volts. And that 0 and 5 volts can then be interpreted by the EFIS and displayed as a fuel quantity all the way down to 1/10 of a gallon. B-Light fuel probe system. And also this cutout for the tank here, this is where the fuel filter is going to be going. So it's going to the output of the tank is going to go here to the fuel filter, and then it'll go forward to the engine. This is another upgrade that I'm making. I have quick disconnects throughout the system, so I can do testing easier. I can replace this fuel filter a lot easier. Right now my fuel filter, I'm just going to have to cut it out. There's no way I'll be able to remove it. Okay, so here is the updated fuel setup here. So I've got my bulkhead fitting is still going towards the electrical fuel pump here, but now this is where it changes. It goes from the electric fuel pump to the engine-driven mechanical fuel pump. Then it goes from the output of the engine-driven fuel pump into the fuel flow sensor here and the fuel pressure sensor here, and then goes directly into the carburetor. So the fuel flow sensor is going to have the fuel pass upwards through it now, and the fuel pressure sensor is going to be able to make sure that we've got a consistent pressure from the engine-driven fuel pump and not just showing me the pressure that's basically on this input line here.